Join me as we sew the Val Breast Form with an overlapped back stuffed with polyester fiberfill. Let's get sewing. Begin by sewing the lower cup seam. You want to be sure that you are sewing the seam with the 2 notches. Our seam allowance is 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Do some back stitching and then come all the way down. I'm just using a regular plain straight stitch. Just backing up here. Okay, there's our seam. We're going to go press this seam allowance open. I'm going to use my boob knob here to help me press. This is the top of a newel post I have nailed to a scrap piece of wood. And the rounded shape just helps me press open the seam allowances on bra cups. Just pressing open using some steam because this is cotton. And here we are. Ready to add our edge stitching now. I'm going to go somewhat close to the seam, not right on top of it, and not all the way out at the edge of the seam allowance either, because we'll want to trim some of that extra seam allowance away. I'm maybe not even 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. Coming down to the end, and I'm just going to sew across. I'm within the seam allowance here, and come back down the other side. And see there's some extra seam allowance here, so we can just take some scissors and cut it off. And I like to just wrap the piece kind of around my finger. Helps that extra seam allowance pop up. And I can just trim across. Okay, I'm gonna do this for the other side as well. I'm ready to join the lower cup and upper cup pieces together, and you'll want to make sure you have them oriented correctly. You'll want all these notches to match up, so don't have this lower part of the piece sticking up. So these are the wrong sides, so I'm going to put these right sides together and start matching. Now I marked my notches, right sides together. I marked my notches with a washout marker, but you can snip your notches if that's what you prefer. You'll just need to make sure that they are snipped less than 1/4 of an inch, since that's our seam allowance. And I use washout markers. I use the Crayola washout markers. I like them better than the official fabric markers. And they wash out pretty easily in cotton fabric. Okay, go around to the other side. Maybe one more pin at the end. Okay, let's go to the machine. Okay, let's start off with some back stitching. And once again, we will just use a regular straight stitch with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Back stitching. Okay, there it is. Let's go press. Once again, I'm using my boob knob here to help me press. Just found this newel post at the hardware store. Didn't have to do anything to it except nail it to another piece of wood to give it a base. Go edge stitch. I'm pressing this as flat as I can. Relatively close to my stitching line here. Okay, I'm going to turn because I'm at the top, go across, and come back down again. presser foot is necessary to make sure that your fabric is flat. When you're edge stitching, there really isn't a need to backstitch. Okay, let's cut our excess seam allowance. It's really helpful to have some sharp, short-bladed scissors for this. These are actually embroidery scissors, I think. But they are very good for trimming seam allowance. Okay, now I'm going to cut the other side. I will be using the overlapped back option, and the first thing we need to do is finish these edges. I'm going to do that on my serge. Now that the upper edge is finished, we're going to press back the hem allowance, and that's folded right at the notches, and this is the wrong side, so you'll want to press towards the wrong side. And you'll want to repeat that for the upper piece. Now in my instructions, I don't have you stitch this down, but you can if you want to. I just wanted to make the least amount of stitching possible on the back so that it would be not irritating to someone who has very sensitive skin. Okay, and you will want to align this lower pressed edge. Let's do it this way. I can see my notches through the fabric here. You'll want to align this lower pressed edge with the notches, and I flip this over so that it's right side up. And I have the top part on top over the back. It could depend on the wearer though, of where they want the opening. Depending on where they have scar tissue, you could change it so that it's the lower section on top and the opening is further up. It's just your preference and what works for you. So align those at the notches and just add a couple pins to hold it in place. And you will want to baste within the seam allowances just to keep these two pieces together. So you'll just want to baste in this section on both sides. Slightly within my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to baste to hold these two pieces together. I'm not going to worry about any sort of back stitching because we don't need it. And repeat for the other side. Okay, our back is now assembled. Now we're going to pin together the front and the back, and this might be the only sort of tricky bit of the pattern to make sure everything aligns. So you want to align the notches that are at the top and a pin, and align the bottom, the seam with this notch, and then you'll just want to go around adding pins until all the edges are aligned. I'll come back with it. I've got my front and back all pinned together. Use as many pins as you think necessary. And we're going to sew around the entire thing. With the overlapped back, you can sew around the entire thing. You don't have to worry about leaving an opening for turning. And I like to start at the bottom because it's relatively flat here. You won't be going right into a curve. And just use the regular straight stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance. We will want to add some back stitching at this point. And just take your time going around, moving your pins as you go, making sure everything is staying really nice and flat at the stitching line. There are some curved edges, so take your time, lift your presser foot as much or as often as you need to get around those curves. It really helps if you have a knee lift. Then you can keep hold of your piece with both hands. add some back stitching. And there we are. Now let's flip it over. Make sure everything looks good. That was just the edge of the fabric getting caught. You want to make sure there aren't any tucks or anything that we don't want. Now before we turn it, you'll want to trim the seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. I know a lot of people would clip the curves. I just don't like clipping. I feel like it leaves really ragged edges. You can clip if you prefer that, if that's your preferred method. I'd rather just trim 1/8 of an inch around the entire edge. Okay, throw all that away. Let's press around the edges before we turn it. Okay, now we can turn it through our overlapped back edge. And there it is. We are ready for stuffing. Stuffing with just some polyester fiber film. You can find this at most craft stores. I think I even bought this at Walmart. And the key to getting this to look nice is to use very small amounts. Don't just take a giant wad and stuff it in there, because we want this to be filled evenly and not have any lumpiness. So I'm just going to take really small bits, and I'm going to begin by pushing it into the bottom and the corners, because it's easy to get it in the middle. It's not so easy to get it all the way into the corners. And the amount of fiber fill is up to you. If you're making this for someone else, I would overstuff it, and then the wearer can adjust the level to their needs. With the knitted knockers, which is the knitted version of a breast form, I've seen them really overstuffed, and it doesn't quite look natural to me. So I tried to taper the amount of stuffing that goes up to the edges. I don't like it super stuffed, but that'll be up to the wearer. So give them enough that they can remove some however they see fit. Just adding small amounts here. And now that I've filled in the edges, I'm really pressing it into the edges. I can concentrate more in the middle. I think once I put this last bit in there, that'll be good. Before you stuff it, you can press along the seam allowance if you want. I feel like the stuffing just presses open the edges on its own. Okay, so I've flattened out the opening, and there it is. There is our Val Breast Form. I hope you found this sewing tutorial helpful. Happy sewing.